In the vast and unforgiving expanse of the Sahara Desert, where the sun blazed mercilessly and the wind whispered secrets through the dunes, a man named David found himself utterly alone. His journey had begun with a sense of adventure, but now it was a desperate struggle for survival. David was a traveler, a man who had spent most of his life exploring the remote corners of the world. He had climbed mountains, trekked through jungles, and sailed across oceans, always searching for the next challenge, the next experience to add to his growing collection of stories. The Sahara was supposed to be just another adventure, a quick journey through one of the most desolate places on earth. But fate had other plans. The trouble began on the third day of his trek. David had hired a guide to lead him through the desert, but a violent sandstorm had hit without warning, sweeping across the dunes with terrifying force. In the chaos, David had become separated from his guide and his small caravan of camels. The storm had raged for hours, and when it finally passed, David was alone, lost in a sea of sand, with no sign of his guide or the path they had been following. His supplies were meager. He had a small amount of water, a few packets of dried food, and a satellite phone with no signal. The vast desert stretched out before him in every direction, an endless expanse of rolling dunes and scorching heat. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He was stranded, and if he didn't find help soon, the desert would claim him. For hours, David walked, trying to retrace his steps, but the shifting sands had erased any sign of his previous path. The sun beat down on him relentlessly, and his water supply dwindled rapidly. Every dune he climbed seemed to lead to another, and another, with no end in sight. His once keen sense of direction faltered as the landscape blurred into a disorienting maze of sand and sky. As the hours turned into days, David's situation grew more dire. The intense heat sapped his strength, and the nights, though cooler, offered little relief. Each morning, he would rise with a glimmer of hope, thinking that perhaps today he would find a way out, maybe a distant oasis, or a caravan passing through. But each day, the desert remained unchanged, indifferent to his plight. By the fourth day, David's water was nearly gone. His lips were cracked and dry, his skin burned from the relentless sun. He could feel his body weakening, the effects of dehydration and exhaustion taking their toll. But still, he pressed on, driven by a stubborn will to survive. On the fifth day, delirious from thirst and heat, David began to see things. At first, they were fleeting shadows on the horizon, blurs that he couldn't quite make out. He convinced himself that it was just the desert playing tricks on him, but the visions grew stronger. He saw people, walking through the sand, their forms shifting in and out of focus like mirages. He called out to them, but they never responded, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. By the sixth day, David's mind was unraveling. The desert was no longer just a vast emptiness, it was alive, a living entity that seemed to mock him with every step he took. He imagined hearing voices carried on the wind, voices that spoke in languages he didn't understand. Sometimes they seemed to call his name, luring him deeper into the desert's embrace. That night, as he lay on the cold sand beneath a sky full of stars, David reached a breaking point. He had no more strength left to continue. His water was gone, and his body was failing him. He closed his eyes, thinking that this might be the end. The desert would claim him, as it had claimed so many before. But just as he was about to surrender to the darkness, something stirred deep within him, a faint but persistent instinct to survive. Memories of his past adventures flashed through his mind, the challenges he had overcome, the risks he had taken. He remembered the thrill of conquering the impossible, the joy of pushing himself beyond his limits. And he realized that he couldn't give up. Not yet. With renewed determination, David forced himself to stand. He began to walk again, one foot in front of the other, even though every step felt like agony. The desert was silent, save for the sound of his labored breathing and the crunch of sand beneath his feet. But he kept moving, driven by a flicker of hope that somewhere, somehow, he might find salvation. Hours passed, and then, just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, David saw something, an unnatural shape in the distance, something that didn't belong to the desert. He squinted, his vision blurry from exhaustion, but as he got closer, he realized what it was, a small building, half buried in the sand. It was an old, abandoned outpost, once used by desert travelers long ago. The structure was crumbling, but it was real. With the last of his strength, David stumbled toward it. Inside, he found shade from the blistering sun, and in a corner, hidden beneath the rubble, a small cache of supplies, an old water canteen, still half full, and a few forgotten food rations. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep him alive. David stayed at the outpost for several days, slowly regaining his strength. He rationed the water and food carefully, and each night, he rested beneath the stars, grateful for another day of life. And then, on the 10th day, he heard it, the distant sound of engines. A rescue team, alerted by his missing guide, had been searching for him. They had finally found his location through a weak signal from his satellite phone, and as the helicopter descended to the sand, David felt an overwhelming wave of relief. As he was airlifted out of the desert, David looked down at the vast expanse of dunes below. The desert had tested him in ways he had never imagined, pushing him to the brink of his endurance. But he had survived. And though the desert had nearly claimed him, it had also given him something, a deeper understanding of his own strength, and the knowledge that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit could endure. Back in the safety of civilization, David told his story to others, recounting the days of isolation and struggle in the Sahara. And while his adventures would continue, he would never forget the lessons the desert had taught him, the power of resilience, the importance of hope, and the strength that could be found even in the most desolate places on earth.